April 23, 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing in on itself. Cities in flames, roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops. The Reich reduced to smoldering fragments of its former arrogance. The 69th Infantry Division advanced through Saxony with weary determination. Rifles slung but nerves taut. Every shadow a possible sniper, every farmhouse a potential trap. For days the men had encountered devastation. Burned wagons, collapsed bridges, towns where even the church bells seemed silenced in mourning. They were battle-hardened now, accustomed to corpses on the roadside and the sour smell of death woven into the spring air. Yet nothing could have prepared them for what they stumbled upon outside Leipzig that morning. Beyond a low ridge, hidden behind rusted wire and sagging watchtowers, lay a compound that bore all the marks of a labor camp. Guard posts abandoned, barracks leaning against one another like exhausted men, the stench of rot heavy in the breeze. The soldiers moved cautiously, expecting mines or ambush. The lieutenant raised his hand, signaling silence, and they advanced with bayonets fixed. A barn-like structure stood at the center, its door marked with a faded red curtain. Some assumed it was a supply cache. Others joked darkly about another slaughterhouse. One private muttered, "If it's more dead cows." "I'm turning vegetarian." The nervous laughter evaporated as they pried open the door. Inside, the air was close with perfume gone rancid, smoke lingering like old secrets. The room was lined with narrow beds, thin mattresses stained and sagging, each corner draped with curtains meant to mimic privacy. And sitting on those beds, arranged in eerie silence, were women, dozens of them young, no older than 25, some barely beyond adolescence. Their faces were powdered, lips painted, but the makeup was cracked, streaked by tears and exhaustion. They looked at the Americans not with hope, but with dread, as if the uniforms only meant another round of violation. One woman instinctively pulled her shawl tight, another dropped her gaze to the floor. The soldiers froze. They had expected prisoners in striped uniforms, skeletal men gasping for freedom. Instead, here were women dressed for seduction yet starved, their beauty weaponized against their will. The contrast was almost unbearable. Sergeant Robert Hayes, a Midwestern farm boy whose hands had once milked cows at dawn, whispered, "My God, they're not prisoners, they're hostages." His words seemed to hang in the air, clarifying what everyone sensed but could scarcely comprehend. The lieutenant ordered the men to lower their rifles. He stepped forward slowly, hands open, voice steady but gentle. "It's over. You're safe now." The words, translated by a Polish-American private who spoke halting Slavic, drew no immediate reaction. The women had been conditioned by years of brutality to expect promises as preludes to pain. One girl, perhaps 17, tilted her head slightly and asked in a fragile voice, "How much do you pay me?" The translator faltered, then repeated her question aloud. A stunned silence followed, broken only when one of the GIs muttered, "Nothing. We're not here for that. You're free." The word seemed to mean nothing at first. Free? It sounded like a riddle, an unfamiliar tune. Some women looked away. Others whispered among themselves, uncertain whether this was liberation or simply a new set of masters with different accents. One clutched a ragged doll to her chest, as though trying to remind herself she was still human, still capable of love. The Americans, untrained for such encounters, fumbled between soldierly discipline and human instinct. A medic set down his kit, unwrapped bandages, and offered a crust of bread. The women hesitated, staring at the food as if it were bait. When the medic tore off a piece and ate it himself before handing the rest over, one girl reached out with trembling fingers, eyes filling as she bit into real bread for the first time in months. That small act broke the dam. Others surged forward, desperate, clutching the loaves and chocolate rations the soldiers passed out. Tears streaked through their caked makeup. The men, hardened by months of carnage, felt their throats tighten. These were not nameless civilians glimpsed at a distance. These were women who had been forced to live inside a machine of exploitation, ordered to smile, while their souls withered. Hayes scribbled in his journal later that night. The Germans had found a way to turn sin into paperwork. Ledgers by the door, names and numbers like livestock. And still these girls looked more alive than the SS men we buried. The brothel was not an aberration, but part of a system. Some of the Americans recognized the German efficiency, rotas pinned to walls, lists of appointments scheduled like train timetables. It was bureaucracy pressed into service of dehumanization, where flesh was accounted for like munitions. The soldiers who read German shook their heads in disbelief. They even stamped the sheets, one said bitterly. The irony stung. A regime obsessed with purity had engineered organized debasement on an industrial scale. Among the women, mistrust lingered. Some refused to approach, convinced that once the initial kindness wore off, the old demands would return. But slowly, gestures began to speak louder than uniforms. A GI removed his field jacket and draped it around the shoulders of a shivering woman. Another pulled out a photograph of his wife and children, showing her as if to prove he wasn't there to harm, but to connect. In those small moments, something shifted. The silence of fear began to fracture into whispers of disbelief. Outside, the rest of the camp lay abandoned, evidence of hurried flight by its German overseers. Yet the discovery inside that red-curtained building weighed heavier on the soldiers than any burned barracks or empty watchtower. They had liberated towns, prisoners, even whole factories of forced laborers. But here, in this quiet chamber, liberation was measured not in strategic gains but in human dignity restored. However, tentatively, as the day waned, the Americans organized transport for the women, calling in medics and chaplains. The women gathered their few belongings, scarves, trinkets, sometimes nothing at all, moving hesitantly toward the open gates. Still, many glanced back, unsure whether stepping out meant escape or merely another chapter in captivity. For them, freedom was too foreign to trust immediately. One soldier, watching them shuffle forward, shook his head and said, almost to himself, "We thought we came here to end a war. Turns out we came here to prove kindness still exists." It was a line no one argued with. Yet as dusk settled, and the women were led beyond the wire, a deeper question lingered. Could compassion heal what systematic cruelty had carved into their souls? Could bread and bandages undo years of degradation? The soldiers didn't know, and the women dared not believe it. The story was not over. What waited beyond the camp gates was uncertain, and perhaps even more terrifying than what lay behind them. The red curtain at the door swayed gently in the wind, a mute witness to horrors endured, and the fragile hope of something new. And as the last light faded, one young woman paused, turned back, and whispered in her own tongue. Words no soldier understood, but all felt in their bones. It was not gratitude nor fear, but something between, the dawning shock of freedom. The Americans soon realized what they had uncovered was not some isolated curiosity, not a lone aberration tucked into the ruins of a collapsing Reich, but a system planned, sanctioned, and carefully maintained. Reports from other advancing units told the same story. Camp brothels scattered across occupied Europe, each operating under the same rules of cruelty disguised as order. The discovery outside Leipzig was a window into a much wider machine, one that had turned women into numbers and routine into ritual. The soldiers began piecing together the evidence. They found rosters posted on the walls, written in crisp German script, detailing shifts like factory schedules. Women's names were replaced by numbers, their nationality reduced to abbreviations. Some rooms still held ledgers where guards had stamped dates beside entries, marking visits like one might record cattle feedings. To the Americans hardened by battlefields, there was something especially grotesque in this clerical neatness. War could be savage, but this was cold. Calculated, it was no accident. In 1942, Heinrich Himmler had authorized the creation of camp brothels, intended in official language to improve morale among certain prisoners and officers while discouraging homosexuality. Behind such bureaucratic phrasing lay the brutal reality. Thousands of women, dragged from Poland, Ukraine, France, the Netherlands, and even from as far as Korea and China, herded into barracks and told their service was now to the Reich. A small number had been deceived, offered jobs as secretaries or cooks, only to find themselves locked behind barbed wire and pushed onto straw mattresses. For most, there had been no choice at all. One Ukrainian woman, liberated at Buchenwald, would later recall in testimony, "They said we would help the wounded. But when the door closed, they handed me rouge and told me to smile. I had no words for that kind of betrayal." Another, from Poland, described standing in line to be selected, like livestock, her fate sealed by a nod from a camp official. These accounts, gathered decades later, confirmed what the soldiers glimpsed in the moment: a vast machinery of exploitation disguised by euphemism. The contrast was impossible to miss. The Germans had preached purity, paraded their ideology of moral discipline, and yet here was the rotten core, rooms where officers and prisoners with privileges bought time with women who could not refuse. American soldiers who stumbled across these brothels often muttered the same bitter refrain: "So much for their so-called honor." One GI even scribbled in a letter home, "If this is what they fought for, they've already lost." The environment inside these special blocks was a perverse parody of normalcy. Curtains hung to feign privacy, cheap perfume distributed to mask the stench of disease, makeup provided like rations to ensure the illusion of willing smiles. Women were sometimes instructed to dress in bright skirts or blouses scavenged from deported civilians, as if the costumes could hide their captivity. The Americans who entered described the surreal dissonance: lipstick beside barbed wire, rouge smeared across faces hollowed by hunger. Medics cataloged the consequences with grim precision. Many of the women were infected with syphilis or gonorrhea. Some bore scars from beatings when they resisted. A number were pregnant, the fathers unknown or already dead in the chaos of retreat. One army doctor noted in his report, "Of the women examined, nearly all are malnourished, many diseased. Their condition speaks to prolonged neglect and abuse." The cold phrasing could not capture the tears in the women's eyes as they endured yet another examination, this time under the promise it would not be followed by violence. The women themselves had lived in constant dissonance. They were prisoners, and yet dressed up as companions. They were forced to serve men, yet stripped of any identity as women. Some spoke of being ordered to laugh, to flirt, to pretend, while a guard stood at the door with a rifle. Others recalled the silence afterward, the weight of shame as heavy as the chains they no longer wore. The psychological cruelty rivaled the physical, and yet in the midst of their testimony, a different shock surfaced: their disbelief at American behavior. Many admitted they had expected nothing different from their liberators. They assumed the GIs would treat them as spoils, perhaps with even less restraint than the Germans. Instead, they were met with food, medical care, and most confounding of all, respect. One Frenchwoman later said, "When he called me Madame, I laughed. I thought it was a cruel joke, but he meant it." That reversal of expectation was as staggering as the freedom itself. For the soldiers, the confrontation with the system stirred conflicting emotions: pity, anger, even shame that such cruelty had existed without their knowledge. Some confessed to nightmares long afterward, haunted less by the gunfire of battle than by the sight of young women sitting quietly on their beds, waiting for what they assumed must come next. Liberation should have been a moment of joy, but here it felt muted, tainted by years of suffering that could not be erased by a single act of kindness. Still, humor crept in at the edges, not out of disrespect but as a salve against despair. Corporal quipped, "Only the Germans could run a brothel like a train station." Another added, "With the same punctuality too." The men chuckled bitterly, and the women, not understanding the words, still seemed to sense the absurdity being mocked. Laughter, even in fragments, felt like rebellion against the system that had forced silence. The Americans documented everything. Photographs were taken, reports filed, diaries scribbled in haste. They wanted proof, not only for headquarters but for themselves, to believe that what they had seen was real. Some of those images would surface years later, silent witnesses to a truth many found difficult to confront. Historians would debate the scale, the purpose, the exact numbers, but for the soldiers and women who lived it, the reality was undeniable. Night fell, and the camp seemed to sink deeper into shadow, as if ashamed of itself. The women huddled together, clutching the blankets and rations given to them, whispering in half a dozen languages. The Americans set guards, not against escape but against intrusion, determined no further harm would come. Yet beneath the relief lay an unanswered question: what came next? Freedom was a word, but the world beyond the barbed wire was still scarred, still suspicious. still ready to judge. For some of these women, leaving the brothel meant returning not to families but to silence, to nations unwilling to hear their stories. A young soldier, barely 20, watched them as the stars emerged overhead. He had stormed across rivers, faced mortar fire, and seen comrades fall. But here, among women wrapped in wool blankets, he felt more helpless than ever. "How do you give back a life?" he whispered to no one in particular. The question hung heavy in the night, echoing across the barracks where the ledgers still lay on the tables. The pages recorded transactions, times, and names, but they could not measure what had been stolen. And as dawn threatened on the horizon, the red curtain in the doorway fluttered again, casting its shadow like a wound across the floor. Behind it lay the evidence of a system so carefully hidden, so meticulously run, that only now, at the end of the war, was it being torn into the light. For the women, liberation had come, but belief in it was still just beginning. The gate swung open, and for the first time in years the women stepped beyond the perimeter of their prison. Yet liberation was not greeted with cheers or songs. It was a hesitant, trembling procession, each step weighted with suspicion, as though freedom itself might be a cruel trick. American soldiers guided them gently toward waiting trucks, their hands open, their voices lowered, but the women's eyes darted from uniform to uniform, searching for the familiar signs of threat. After all, uniforms had always meant danger. One Ukrainian girl, her hair cropped unevenly from lice treatment, pressed herself against the side of the truck and whispered to a medic through an interpreter, "How much do you pay me?" Her voice was so thin it almost dissolved into the spring air. The medic shook his head, baffled, and answered, "Nothing. We don't pay. We don't take. You're free." The words struck her like a stone dropped into deep water, ripples spreading in disbelief. She repeated it softly, as if testing its weight, then clutched the bread he offered as though it might vanish. For others, disbelief turned into panic. A French woman refused to climb into the vehicle, certain that another camp awaited beyond the trees. "They always say it is over," she cried, "but it is never over." A chaplain placed his hand on her shoulder, and with painstaking calm told her that the war was ending, that Paris was free, that she could go home. The words seemed like fairy tales, fragments of a life she could no longer imagine. Still, she climbed aboard, her knuckles white around the rosary she had hidden in her bodice. The Americans themselves struggled to process the scene. They had envisioned liberation as a surge of gratitude, a chorus of relief. Instead, they saw hollow eyes, stiff postures, and tears that carried no joy. A corporal wrote in his diary that night, "They cried not because they were free, but because they did not believe it." Imagine a freedom so foreign it feels like another prison. His words captured the strange weight pressing down on the victory. On the road out of the compound, the trucks bounced over ruts and the women swayed together in silence. One soldier, trying to ease the tension, pulled out a Hershey bar from his ration kit and broke it into pieces. He handed them down the line. For a moment, suspicion lingered. Then a young Polish girl bit into the chocolate, and her face crumpled. Not with delight, but with grief. The sweetness, alien after years of bitter broth, overwhelmed her. She sobbed openly, clutching the tiny piece as if it carried her back to childhood. Others followed, tasting the sugar and breaking into tears, laughter, or both. The soldier looked away quickly, embarrassed by the intensity of their reaction, muttering, "It's just candy." But it was not just candy. It was proof that gentleness still existed. The medics who examined the women recorded malnutrition, venereal disease, pregnancies, and infections. Yet what struck them more than the physical wounds was the mistrust. One doctor recalled how every gesture, even the offering of a blanket, was met with suspicion until proven otherwise. The women flinched when men approached, braced for orders, waited for blows. It took time, hours, days, for them to recognize that these Americans were not repeating the old cycle. One survivor would later write, "When the doctor touched my arm, I closed my eyes, waiting. But the pain never came. He only checked my pulse. I could not stop trembling." The GIs, many barely older than the women themselves, wrestled with emotions they could not easily articulate. Some admitted they felt ashamed, not of anything they had done, but of belonging to the same species as the men who had orchestrated such cruelty. Others felt protective, wanting to shield these women not just from bullets but from memory itself. A sergeant from Ohio reportedly said, "We came here to fight soldiers, but I feel like I should have been here sooner for them." His words were echoed by many. The sense that victory on the battlefield was hollow beside the fragility of the lives they had rescued. And yet, humanity flickered even amid despair. At one makeshift camp, a group of soldiers taught liberated women a simple American song. "You are my sunshine." The words were foreign, but the melody caught, and soon thin, cracked voices sang in halting unison. The sound was uneven, off-key, but the soldiers clapped along, and for a brief moment the air vibrated with something dangerously close to joy. One GI later joked, "The Nazis might have kept schedules, but they sure didn't keep rhythm." The laughter that followed was brittle but real, and it startled the women almost as much as the chocolate had. Still, liberation carried shadows. Some women recoiled from the idea of returning home, fearing rejection. A Polish girl whispered to a nurse, "If they know where I was, they will call me traitor." Others clung desperately to their rescuers, terrified of being left behind. An American chaplain wrote in his notes, "They cling not to us, but to the idea that someone, anyone, might still see them as more than what they were forced to become." As news of these brothels spread through the ranks, soldiers compared stories from other camps. In Dachau, women had fallen to their knees, kissing the boots of their liberators, only to be gently lifted back to their feet. At Buchenwald, one survivor asked an American if he was real or a dream sent by God. In each case, disbelief mingled with gratitude, the mind struggling to accept what the body craved: safety. By nightfall, the liberated women lay on cots in field hospitals, wrapped in blankets, their hair washed, their wounds treated. Some slept for the first time without fear of a door opening in the dark. Others remained awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps that never came. Freedom, it seemed, was as frightening as captivity, if only because it was unfamiliar. For the Americans, too, the experience altered something fundamental. They had seen war's brutality, but this was its quiet cruelty, the corruption of intimacy itself. One lieutenant confessed in a letter, "I thought I knew what we were fighting for. Today, I finally understood." His words carried both conviction and sorrow, the sense that victory was no triumph when measured against years of stolen dignity. And yet the story did not end with blankets and chocolate. Liberation was only the first step, and for many of these women, the hardest journey still lay ahead. Into societies eager to forget, into families that might turn away, into memories that would never fade. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in pale gold, the women stirred under their blankets, some clutching bread, others clutching each other. They were alive, yes, but survival carried a new question, one as heavy as the chains they had left behind. The war ended. But for the women liberated from the camp brothels, peace was a word heavy with contradictions. They had stepped beyond the wire, received food, bandages, even laughter from soldiers who treated them with dignity. Yet freedom proved more complicated than a single open gate. Many were carried by trucks to displaced persons camps, where survivors of ghettos and labor battalions gathered under Red Cross tents. There, amid the chaos of relief and bureaucracy, their stories were difficult to place. Prisoners of war could be counted, documented, and exchanged. Political detainees could be listed by name. But what category existed for women who had been forced into brothels? Their suffering did not fit neatly into the columns of liberation. The Americans who had witnessed them struggled too. A chaplain admitted in his report, "We can feed them, clothe them, but how do we explain to the world what was done? Their scars are not always visible." Some soldiers carried photographs of the women they had met, tucked into journals beside pressed flowers, as though proof of existence might give weight to voices history would otherwise forget. A lieutenant wrote home to his wife in Illinois, describing a young Frenchwoman who wept when he called her Mademoiselle. He concluded with the line, "The war has taught me what cruelty means, but she taught me what kindness can repair." The women themselves faced an agonizing paradox. In the brothels, they had been forced to perform intimacy without consent. Outside, they longed for ordinary love, for families, for homes where their names were spoken gently. Yet the stigma followed them like a shadow. In Poland and Ukraine, Whispers of betrayal or collaboration awaited women who admitted what had happened. Some chose silence, returning to villages with a lie about where they had been. Others emigrated, seeking new lives in America or France, where anonymity offered a kind of refuge. A few testified publicly decades later, their trembling voices cutting through years of enforced forgetting. One survivor speaking in the 1990s said, "When the Americans gave me bread, I thought it was charity. Only later did I see it was recognition. I was still human." Historians pieced the fragments together slowly. Records confirmed at least 10 major concentration camps maintained brothels: Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and others. Documents revealed quotas, payment ledgers, official orders signed in the same offices where death transports were organized. Testimony from survivors painted the picture with unbearable detail. The smell of powder and disinfectant, the constant fear of disease, the sound of boots outside the door. Numbers were estimated: between 200 and 500 women forced in some camps, several thousand in total. But numbers could not capture the weight of silence carried across decades. For the soldiers who had seen the brothels firsthand, memory became both a burden and a compass. One medic admitted to nightmares in which he offered bread, only for it to turn to ash in the women's hands. Another soldier, interviewed in the 1970s, said, "You fight a war thinking you'll remember the battles. But what I remember is a girl too scared to eat a candy bar." Their testimonies became part of oral history, reminders that liberation was not always a triumphant march, but sometimes a fragile negotiation between trauma and trust. And yet, even amid the pain, moments of transformation surfaced. Women who had been treated as property discovered in small gestures a rebirth of dignity. A blanket placed gently over their shoulders, a soldier turning his back to give privacy, a chaplain kneeling to pray not for them, but with them. These acts, trivial to outsiders, struck the survivors with the force of revelation. They had lived in a system where men's hands only took. Suddenly they encountered hands that gave. That contrast was more shocking than liberation itself. Time did not erase the scars, but it reshaped them. Some survivors married, raised families, carried their secrets silently while tucking children into bed with tenderness they themselves had been denied. Others never escaped the shadow, haunted by disease, infertility, or shame. In every case, their legacy was one of survival against an organized cruelty that sought to erase them. By enduring, by refusing to vanish, they defied the machinery that had reduced them to ledgers and numbers. The world, however, was slow to listen. For decades after the war, camp brothels were a footnote in scholarship, an uncomfortable subject often avoided in official histories. Only in the late 20th century did testimonies surface in wider circulation, reminding scholars and citizens alike that liberation stories carried layers of silence. Some of the women were already gone by then, their voices preserved only in fragments recorded by archivists. The delay in recognition deepened the tragedy, as though their lives had been doubly erased, first by captivity, then by memory. Still, traces endured. In museums, artifacts appeared: a makeup compact found in Buchenwald, a ledger from Mauthausen, a red curtain salvaged from a barracks door. Visitors stared at these objects with disbelief, trying to reconcile them with the idea of systematic exploitation. One historian remarked, "These items are both ordinary and unbearable. A lipstick tube should not belong in a concentration camp. Yet here it is." Such juxtapositions revealed how ideology twisted the most intimate objects into instruments of control. For the Americans who had been young soldiers in 1945, the memory remained as a quiet reminder of what victory meant. Not the flags raised, not the treaties signed, but the moment a woman dared to eat bread without fear. They carried those images into old age, telling their grandchildren not about medals, but about kindness rediscovered in the ruins of cruelty. One veteran at his funeral was remembered for saying, "I knew we'd won the war when I saw a girl put down her shawl and smile without being told to." The legacy of those brothels is not just a footnote of history, but a mirror. They remind us that systems of oppression thrive, not only through violence, but through the normalization of exploitation. And they remind us that liberation is never just an act of breaking chains, but of restoring dignity. The women freed in 1945 were not simply victims. They were survivors who taught the world what it means to endure. Their disbelief at kindness, their tears at chocolate and bread, remain one of the most haunting testaments of the war. And yet, as the decades passed, a question lingered. If the Americans had shocked them by offering compassion, what did that say about the world they returned to? Would societies receive them with the same gentleness? Or would they be pushed back into silence, their stories unwelcome? The war had ended with guns falling silent, but the battle for memory and recognition had only just begun.